us at this virtual talk. Sorry, there was a recording announcement there, which I'll mention in a moment. Thank you very much for joining us at this virtual talk, which is being hosted by St Cat's, and it's fantastic to see so many of you here. There were sort of 25, 26 people on the call last time I looked. My name's Dr. Jessica Goodman. I'm a fellow here at St Cat's. I'm Director of Studies in French. My work centres on the early modern period, in particular the 18th century in France, and questions of how authors thought about their reputations and tried to shape them. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce my colleague, Professor Bart van Es, who, as you'll know, is Professor of English at Oxford and Fellow at St Cat's. And he's also currently acting as Pro Master following the retirement of Kirsty Boyers in July. So he's a very busy man at the moment. Bart's area of research encompasses a wide range of English literature. He also used to specialise in the early modern period in particular, with a special focus on Renaissance drama. But he's now turned towards what he describes as creative non-fiction. He's the author of several books already on Shakespeare and Spenser, and his book, The Cutout Girl, which was based on a true story that was part of his own family history, won the Costa Book of the Year award in 2018. And his next book is called True Fire, and that forms the basis of this talk, and it will be released next year. So in this book, True Fire, St Augustine in an Age of Crisis, Bart will examine how a world in crisis transformed Augustine and how he in turn transformed our world. And Bart will draw parallels with crises today, including things like climate change and border wars and migration and political extremism. And he will use those questions to explore why St Augustine is starkly relevant to our own troubled century. So I'm now going to hand over to Bart, who'll speak for about 30 minutes. I'm sure there will be lots and lots of questions, and please hold those questions for the end, or if you want to, feel free to put them in the chat and we can come back to them at the end. When it does come to question time, and we'll have plenty of time for questions, please, if you can, use the raise hand gesture that's at the bottom of the screen, and please do stay on mute for the duration of the talk if you possibly can, so that we can hear Bart as best possible. Just a quick note as well, the talk itself is going to be recorded, but the question and answer portion of the talk won't be recorded. So if you speak then, don't worry, you won't figure in any recordings. So without further ado, thank you very much, Bart, and we look forward to your talk. Bart, you're on mute still, I'm afraid.
All right, I had not muted myself that I was aware of. I think that the host had muted me. Sorry. Thank you so much, Jess, and welcome to all the members of the Dean Kitchen Society. We're immensely grateful to you all as legators to the college, and I'm particularly aware of how important the thing that is in my current role as Pro Master. It's also rather nice as Pro Master to be talking about research, which has slightly taken a back seat to my day-to-day duties, but as Jess says, this is a book that I'm working on that needs to be submitted in October next year. Excitingly, I do have 7 different publishers for it, so it feels a lot of pressure as well as a lot of excitement to think that that's taking shape now. So the idea for this book came to me quite suddenly, really, only about this time last year, and it was during an interview I heard on political thinking with Nick Robinson. It's a program, I don't know if people know it, but the format is supposed to be a conversation with rather than an interrogation of a person whose political thinking has shaped our world. And for this episode of Political Thinking, the person being interviewed was Roger Hallam, the founder of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, amongst other things. And usually the conversation is very much a kind of two-way, kind of guided biography that Nick Robinson takes people through. And it's had people from all kinds of positions, whether that's kind of conservatives or Labour people, and you get a sense of their biography. What was kind of fascinating about this particular interview is that right from the beginning, Hallam was somebody who was unprepared to engage in this kind of conversation. And he immediately turned in a highly confrontational way to the host, Nick Robinson. Nick Robinson said, what matters here is your ideas and not mine. And Hallam replied, I disagree with what you've just said. I think it is about you. And what you have chosen to do is have a comfortable life. And this was the beginning of an interview that involved a very, very stark confrontation between worldviews. And what particularly struck me was the way that Hallam was using a very religious language around his convictions to do with climate change and political revolution, really. So he said that very few people would be able to hear him, only one or two, but that those people would be able to see another world, and that in the act of self-sacrifice that was necessary for his movement, there was a certain transcendence, a certain ecstasy while sitting in a prison cell. And he insisted there was one truth, that truth was not negotiable. And he said that hell was coming down the road, and that people like Nick Robinson would ultimately be judged for their complicity with the current system. He used this very moral language around the imposition of evil onto our lives. And amongst other things, he said that Nick Robinson, the journalist, would eventually be put on trial for treason to our society. So Hallam's insistence that we are going to hell, that the coming fire is real, immediately made me think of Christian martyrs and of St. Augustine in particular. And I think there's a wider kind of zeitgeist, really, where the present moment is making quite a lot of people think of parallels between our own time and the last days of the Roman Empire in which Augustine lived. There was a meme going around on the internet around the same time of a video in which a woman was asking lots of men how often they thought about the Roman Empire, and this turned out to be several times a day for a lot of people. And I think there's something in that kind of collective sense that we identify with this moment when a civilization that seemed to be completely permanent suddenly and radically changed. We have this sort of collective sense of a Rome that involves perfect cities with bathhouses and universities and globalization, a kind of culture of dialogue and pluralism, perfect roads, a pan-European identity that kind of fell to pieces very rapidly in the course of the 5th century. And St. Augustine was someone who was at the heart of this. So what do most people know about him? I mean, they probably don't know a lot more than the kind of famous statement that he should be granted chastity, but not yet, from the Confessions, Lord, give me chastity, but not yet. But he's somebody who could be counted amongst the 5 or so most influential people in all of history. So he was born in 354 AD, died in 430 AD. And in that time, he moved from identifying entirely with a Latin Roman Empire. I mean, he was born speaking Latin in North Africa. He was a Berber. He came to Rome, developed himself as an important intellectual. But by the time he died in 430 AD, the Western Empire had collapsed, and he was now bishop of Hippo, modern-day Anabar in Algeria. And he's an astonishingly original thinker. He is, for example, responsible for just war theory. He wrote the first text that we could genuinely call an autobiography. He invented the form of the soliloquy, and he was responsible for the doctrine of original sin that shaped Western Christianity for the next 1,500 years. So here's this immensely influential person, and there are already many excellent biographies of him. So I didn't want to write simply another biography of St. Augustine. I wanted to write a book that would speak to that moment of connection I felt with the moment of that interview with Roger Hallam, which I do recommend you listen to, as it's a kind of really quite compelling confrontation between two different worldviews, both of which I have some sympathy with. I value Nick Robinson as a journalist. I value the kind of ideals that he's putting forward there of dialogue, of toleration, of democratic choice. But then I also think that Hallam is someone quite sincere about his confrontation with crisis, and who's insisting on a very different time scheme for what matters in history, who's thinking about eternity and our obligations to the planet. And I'd like to write a book that reflects a bit on those competing claims and how they might play out over the coming decades as a series of crises start to come towards us, crises that have a lot of parallels to the crises that the Roman Empire faced in Augustine's time. So those are to do with migration, which became a kind of enormous feature of Augustine's time as Eastern tribes flooded into the Western Empire, to do with political culture as the established modes of political discourse collapsed in the empire, and also to do with fire in a different sense for Augustine, because Augustine's core conviction was that humanity was heading for hell, and that society needed to change very radically if the horror of God's judgment was to be avoided. So the way the book works is it's partly based a little bit like The Cutout Girl on my travels. So I spent April going to 4 particularly important places in Augustine's life, taking photographs there. So all the photographs in this slideshow are ones I've taken myself. So I visited these places. I traveled by land to North Africa to visit Augustine's birthplace, amongst other locations. And I want to think about how that moment kind of speaks to our present. So I've also gone to interview Roger Hallam at various times, had a kind of rather exciting cloak and dagger meeting with him in London, where I was given a safe house to go to and then texted a new address and was then kind of led to the kind of base of the Extinction Rebellion operation. I've also recently gone to speak to him in prison now that he has a 5-year jail term for blocking the M25. So that engagement with Hallam will kind of sit alongside what the dominant theme of the book is, which is the question of Augustine's own life. So I'm going to look at Augustine through these 4 moments in his life where he is really a very different sort of person in each of these moments, and he's writing different, very important books. And the first of those moments is Milan in 384 AD. And I want to move through the classical elements as I think about these moments in Augustine's life. So Augustine in 384 AD is professor of rhetoric in what is then the capital of the Roman Empire, Milan. He's part of an intellectual elite. He has friends from an enormous diversity of backgrounds: pagans, Christians, Manichaeans, Arians, agnostics, Platonists. He mixes with an elite. He writes political speeches for the emperor, Justinian II, and for important generals who are based in Milan. He's profoundly interested in culture. He's passionate about theatre. He's passionate about the works of Virgil, which he teaches. So there's something kind of strikingly modern about the world if you describe it in those terms. And it seems to me that he is kind of in air as a mode in various senses. There's something of the kind of modern jet set about the way in which he has moved to the center of the empire from its periphery in North Africa, going first to Rome, where he also had a teaching position, to this very exalted position as the professor of rhetoric in Milan. His life is also rather modern seeming. He has a partner, he has a son, but he's not married with his son. They live in a house with lots of intellectual friends. We know a lot about Numbridius and Alypius, these close African friends of his who were sharing the house. They read a lot of books, they have a lot of debates. So they strike one as kind of rather similar to a set of kind of modern intellectuals you might find in Milan today. They go to the baths every day. It's a city with lots of gymnasia, with a kind of ideal of the human body that's rather like ours. And Augustine is a man on the make. He, as he tells us in the Confessions, is hoping to get a senior government position, to end up with a large estate, and to even more than that is important to him, worldly status is important to him. He wants to be an intellectual success. He's written a book on beauty, which is really what's got him his position. And he spends a lot of time with Symmachus, who is really the kind of lead oligarch and cultural patron of that era, an immensely wealthy Roman politician. So this is a world in a lot of ways like ours, and I think this kind of photograph of the arches of the Forum in Milan with the kind of modern advertising hoardings behind it gives you a sense of that kind of palimpsest that I'm quite interested in Milan, where I was in April. So the way in which Augustine is living in Milan is, immensely intellectually rich. Reading going on. He's intensely interested in scientific developments. He's reading a lot of Plato, reading a lot of Aristotle. He's also reading a lot about Christianity. His mother is a Christian. His father has been a pagan. He's gone through a lot of kind of, I suppose, religious fads in his existence thus far. He's now 30 and living with his partner. And his main concern in 384 is probably that his mother, Monica, who is left behind in Africa, is coming to visit, and she disapproves of the way that he is living with his partner and son in an unmarried condition. But in 384, Augustine is doing very well, but he's also kind of confronted with a sense that he's not really engaging with the truth. So he tells us in the Confessions that he has a sense that there's a greater truth out there that he's not engaging with, something very frightening that would require him to change his way of being. And as the days go on, he becomes more and more unhappy with this feeling of contradiction between his material success, his experience of pleasures in sexuality, in company of people, but that he's not doing anything to kind of truly live up to that higher calling. And at a certain point, he reads the epistles of Paul, and he's profoundly shocked by reading this. So this is a point before the gathered Bible, but he reads a book that is Paul's letters, and it shocks him. And at a certain point, the reading of Paul gives him a kind of breakdown. And in the garden of the villa that he's living in Milan, he starts shaking uncontrollably and has a breakdown. So that seems to me a modern person who's successful, who starts to worry about greater things that they're ignoring. Someone who's in that element of air of being part of a jet set, but also thinking that this rhetoric that he's involved in is just empty air, that he's spreading lies, that all he's doing is teaching people to be better at presenting a political case. So then we have Milan here in the north of Italy. And then my next place to look at is the villa of Cassiciacum, a little bit to the north of Milan, where we find Augustine 2 years later in 386 AD. Now, the Augustine we find in Cassiciacum is very different. Cassiciacum is a villa that belongs to a colleague of his, Verecundus, another academic, and it's been lent to Augustine as a response to this political crisis. He's gone to the villa with a group of his students, with his mother and son and a set of his friends, and they spend about 8 months there. And it's an astonishing moment because they have stenographers there who record the conversations of that group of people over a number of days during that 9-month period. It's really almost like somebody's left a microphone running in a modern apartment. You have these kind of wonderful details in the transcripts of the Cassiciacum period, where, for example, his student Licentius is singing in the toilet, and people sort of are commenting on it, or the pipes are gurgling and wake people up at night, or they have a lot of the conversations in the bathhouse of this villa, and they comment on things like how the windows are not quite even, or how the weather is. So you have this kind of astonishing moment of, again, a world that seems very like ours, a world with running water, with meals being served, an existence of luxury, also a culture of enormous intellectual exchange as this set of students debates things. But Augustine is now a very changed man. He's somebody who has resigned as professor of rhetoric, who believes that Christianity is the truth, although he's actually read very little Christian literature, Christian scripture at this point. But he is very convinced that there is such a thing as a single truth, and that he wants to abandon this earlier sense that really you can argue any case, the kind of classical skepticism that he'd really been born into. And his one kind of core conviction is that there is a single God, that the universe is purposeful, and he's had that sense. So it's at Cassiciacum that he conducts a set of these immensely fascinating intellectual dialogues. These are really the 4 great dialogues of Augustine's early period. And they are against the academics, which I always like, being an academic myself. And I think there is a kind of connection to our own profession as academics here. So in against the academics, Augustine is opposed to relativism. He's supporting the idea that there is a single truth and that you are obliged to act on that truth and emotionally act on it. And so he's very worried about an intellectual culture that simply thinks that bouncing ideas around is enough. Things need to have an effect on the world. He also writes The Good Life, which is really about the question of what makes one truly happy. And he argues that what makes you truly happy is an embrace of the truth, and in particular, a life that is in the service of religion. Then there is On Order, which is the beginnings of Augustine's kind of great philosophical vision that the universe is ordered, and that there are kind of innate proofs for the existence of God. Simply, he kind of anticipates really Descartes' cogito. He says if we just think about what we are, the first thing we know is that we are thinking, and he argues that you then also have an ordered system. So it's a kind of proof of the existence of God from a study of the universe. But then fourthly, and perhaps most radically, he produces a set of internal dialogues called the soliloquies, which are his night thoughts, where he begins this internal conversation about himself, about who he really is and whether it's possible to know yourself. And it's here that we start to see Augustine as one of the most original thinkers of all time. Augustine has a much deeper sense of human psychology, I think, than classicism had been able to have. So he's interested in things like the uncontrollability of desire, the unknowability of your inner anxieties, the way in which your youth has shaped you, the way in which you're never really a single person. The person that you were 1 minute is different to the person in the past. And you can't really know yourself. And this dynamic sense of personhood as being constantly negotiated, constantly in flux, and about the reinterpretation of your past is going to be the seed for the radical new thinking that we get in Augustine's biography, the Confessions. But fundamentally, Augustine in the Cassiciacum period is very happy. He's living a kind of wonderful life with a set of intellectuals. The weather is great, the food is great. They bathe in the bathhouse each day. They are still living the life of classical individuals, even as he is embracing the kind of notion of a new Christianity. And the overwhelming mood of these conversations is one of happiness. So the outcome of these dialogues in Cassiciacum is that Augustine wants to get baptized. He wants to become a Christian. He goes to Milan and is baptized by St Ambrose, whose body you can still see in the Ambrose Basilica. I've taken a photograph of it. And he decides that what he's going to do is go back to Africa and live a life of spiritual retreat in his hometown of Tagaste in what's now the Algerian mountains, part of the Atlas range. So that's his plan. He takes that set of friends, close students and families, they depart, and in the next moment of his life that I'm interested in, he comes to Ostia, and I think comes to earth. So I think of Cassiciacum as water, partly because they spend so much time in the bathhouse, partly because there is this kind of anticipation of baptism coming, and an overwhelming kind of feeling of calm in the idea of cleanliness and so on. But Ostia, and this is Ostia, really a kind of second Pompeii, this is Rome's port. Augustine is there in 387, planning to return to Africa. But when the group get to Ostia, they suddenly find that the Mediterranean has been closed to all shipping. And I think it's really the moment where that world that had seemed so modern starts to rock and shudder. Magnus Maximus, who started a rebellion first in Britain, has now moved into Gaul and threatens the borders of Italy, and his navy has surrounded Italy and is starting a siege of Rome itself. So I think it's almost as if a kind of entire continent were suddenly to lose the control of its airports, its buses, its communications. The food starts to run scarce. What had seemed a kind of perfect system is starting to fall to pieces. And for the first time, tens and then hundreds of thousands of Goths and Vandals start to cross the Rhine in rafts and arrive in the Roman Empire, and the army is no longer able to stop them. This is the concluding part of Augustine's autobiography, the Confessions. It's in that disordered city that Augustine has the first direct experience of God. It's the concluding part of the Confessions, in which he and his mother Monica stand at a window of a mansion in the city, which is, was a huge, rather kind of luxurious ferry port of a city, really, with, a theatre with 5,000 people that had a floodable stage, all kinds of kind of modern technology. They stand at the window and they imagine and feel for a very brief second the kind of vastness of what God might be. And Augustine has this much more radical, vast notion of what God is than his predecessors. So one of his things that he says is, you can't visualize God, and nor is God simply dispersed across everything. God stands outside time. God witnesses the flight of every bumblebee. God is able to speak to each individual person. God is goodness. God is wisdom. God is truth. And it's the kind of epiphanic conclusion to the Confessions, this sense of the presence of God. Monica dies soon after that vision. But very soon afterwards, Augustine then also writes not only the closing episode of the Confessions, which he actually writes later, but he begins to write the dialogue on the free choice of the will, which he begins in Rome when Ostia is closed, a conversation with his friend Evodius. And in that, he starts to have this much darker vision of God's judgment on the world. So he says some really terrifying things on the free choice of the will. For for example, that there is a beauty in deformed children being born because it's a necessary torture for their sinful parents to experience the pain of their children's death. That humanity is fundamentally sinful, fundamentally born with the taint of original sin, and that the only way to make sense of the world is to realize that we're being punished for having fallen in the Garden of Eden, and that God is constantly sending this signal to humanity to come back to him, but that many people are ignoring that and that they are destined for hell. And this profound sense of human beings as corrupted, as of sexuality as a terrible thing, the human body as not a thing of beauty, but something that is broken, starts to press upon Augustine as the society starts to break down, as he experiences the vastness of God, but also as that kind of set of classical ideals start to fall away. So those are kind of quite close moments in Augustine's life that I want to kind of pinpoint in these intellectual fractures. Then I'm finally going to jump to fire Hippo 430 AD, when many years later, we now see an Augustine aged 76. So this is an Augustine who is now one of the most, probably the most influential person in the world. He is the Bishop of Hippo. He has written The City of God, along with around 36 other major theological works, 600 sermons, 360 of his letters survive that we have. He is somebody who has really kind of created the notion of a unified church. But the Roman Empire has gradually collapsed over the course of the last 40 years, during which he has become this immensely important person. And as the empire has collapsed, Augustine's answers to the cause of that collapse of the empire have become more and more convincing. He's developed a completely different notion of causation in time. He's developed a coherent account of the whole history of humanity from the fall to the present, which he argues in The City of God. It's always been a dialogue between the earthly city and the heavenly city, which started already with Cain and Abel. He's developed a new kind of metaphysics of time in which God stands outside time and time should be understood as a dimension. And he has fundamentally set himself against the kind of plurality of debate that he'd been so interested in Milan. In writing De Doctrina Christiania, he's opposed now to the education in rhetoric that had formed him. He wants Christians to learn only the truth. He's also prepared to see the burning of synagogues. He's overseen the destruction of the many rival churches that had existed in Africa, the Arians, the Donatists, the Pelagians. So he has become an absolutist who believes in a single form of truth and who has ruthlessly used his political connections, his building influence, to shut down all other forms of expression and to instead create something much closer to our notion of the universal Catholic Church as it existed throughout the Middle Ages. So Augustine in 430 is in a city that is now the last holdout of the Western Empire. So in 426, the Vandals had crossed from Spain. This is a set of barbarians, I guess we'd call them, who'd initially broken through across the Rhine, have swept into Spain, moving very quickly, besieging cities, torturing citizens. They then cross into North Africa. They burn and rape and loot as they move across this city, this Roman Empire that is really no longer coherently able to resist anything. We have terrifying letters where Augustine is instructing his clergy, you will stand by your parishioners when the Vandals arrive. The women will be raped. You must advise them not to commit suicide because then they will go to hell. You you will stand beside them. You will be willing to be slain. So people are being tortured within sight of the walls of Hippo. He's a very old man. He gives a number of late sermons in that besieged city where he implores his congregation, do not hold on to the old man, the earth. Do not give up on your claims to heaven. So he dies in a small room surrounded by passages from the scriptures in 430 AD. Hippo itself falls a few months later in a hail of rape and fire. And at that point, the Western Empire, as we know it, has collapsed. So Augustine has kind of witnessed the fall of something, but he's also engineered the rise of something, a new, much more coherent, philosophically based notion of Christianity, a radically different notion of what citizenship involves. In many ways, he's brought about a new kind of morality. You know, he's somebody who's opposed to the death penalty, for example, who opposes torture, who has opposed the kind of cruelties of the circus, which he had enjoyed early on. But he's also somebody who is a fundamental anti-Semite, a person who will not tolerate plurality, who has pushed through the way in which Christian mobs have destroyed all of the pagan temples in Africa, have now imposed a kind of uniform notion of what culture should be. So I'm really interested in that story in its own right, but also as a way of kind of playing with some of the ideas that might kind of come into Western consciousness as our own society faces new kinds of pressures, as Jess said, around migration, around truth and democracy, around the climate crisis. You know, Augustine's, for me, a very kind of Janus-faced figure in the same way as Hallam is. And I do respect parts of Hallam, but then I also find it very terrifying the way that Hallam will, for example, the way he speaks about Israel, I find very worrying, how he's really not somebody who believes in democracy. I spent time with some of his publicists who are happy to see a kind of revolution, which would mean the kind of throwing aside of much of what I value. But I also do take seriously his notion that we need to treat the planet differently. So that's the core idea of True Fire. And hopefully it will be a book that kind of combines my own travel experience with an account of Augustine and why his ideas matter. So yeah, this is the first talk I've done on it. It'll be very interesting to see how it comes across to people. It's lovely to be able to share it with the Dean Kitchen Society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bart. I think Lucy is going to stop the recording.